Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 18th of June, 2024 year. A lot of things have happened today, so let's get started. And we will start with you from the Kharkiv direction, where fierce fighting continues both in the settlement of Gluboko and Volchansky, and along the border. Let's start with you. Let's start along the border with more and more personnel, to put it more correctly, coming from the border. From the territory near the settlement of Kosaklopen. In these frames, we can observe with you the work of Russian gunners, identifying the opposition, inflicting fire damage on dugouts, on strong points, on fortified areas. In general, let's say, we can say that there is nothing unusual, in general, some ordinary military routine, but if we increase the number of updates from this region with you, at least from the 1st of June, then we will notice that Russian artillery is working quite tightly, Russian Lancets, drones, and in general. The territory is under tight fire control. Perhaps this is due to the fact that these positions of this territory are located near the site of the main hostilities that are unfolding in Lepsy and Gluboko, so it is here that strikes are carried out. And perhaps Russian units are conducting artillery training before a possible attempt to open the front and attack in the Zolokiv direction. Then we move with you to Gluboko, where very interesting information comes from. As you can see, there is no geolocation from here today, but there is a very interesting report from the North Group of troops. Today, they reported on the events that have occurred over the past day. And it is reported that the Ukrainian units are increasing the intensity and are increasing the fighting masses in general, with the help of which they are trying to break through the defense of the Russian Federation and force the Russian units to retreat from Gluboko. It is reported that over the past day, the VSO units have used several waves of attacks, one of which involved up to 30 soldiers and several pieces of equipment. This was the first attack. This attack was repulsed by Russian units. And a little later, the next wave of the offensive was launched also in the area of the northwest of the settlement. During the second wave of the offensive, up to 90 soldiers and several pieces of equipment took part in the fighting. As a result of the contour strikes, the armed forces of Ukraine lost up to 20 fighters and were forced to roll back. However, in the course of this message, there is an extremely interesting phrase in the report of the Group of Troops of the North. According to the report, Ukrainian units managed to take control of a forest belt located right on the outskirts of the settlement of Gluboko. In other words, there are basically two forest belts here. Here is one forest belt, there is a second forest belt. But based on how the offensives and yesterday's geolocations were conducted along this area recently, we came to the conclusion that most likely the Ukrainian units during the offensive on Gluboko managed to establish control most likely on this forest belt. However, even despite the fact that it was taken under control, the North Group of Troops reports that during the counterattacks, the AFU were forced to roll back from this direction as well. In general, retreat. However, it is not said that Russian units have also regained control over this territory. What do we have? In general, we see with you that the intensity of is only increasing. The AFU will continue to counterattack, and according to the general withdrawal of the North Group of Forces, a NATO summit will be held in Washington on July 17th. And before this date, the armed forces of Ukraine need to demonstrate some kind of result. But in order, perhaps according to the Russian version, to justify further supplies of weapons, including long-range missiles, with which the Ukrainians will be able to strike deep into the territory of the Russian Federation. Then we are moving with you to Volchansk, firm where we also receive a lot of interesting shots, a lot of interesting messages. Let's start with you from the aggregate plant. Today, footage is being published. There are frames on the web, you can find them in the public domain. Ukrainian strikes with the help of a Pedron drone on a certain building in the center of the aggregate plant, and according to this geolocation, the strike was carried out on this part. And based on this, from these frames, we updated the map and painted over another small, let's say, a small building under the control of Russian units. What happens to this part of the Volchansk aggregate plant is not yet clear. It may also be under the control of Russian units. Perhaps there are still Ukrainian units in separate, say, hangars in separate workshops. Over the past day, the armed forces of Ukraine have made several attempts to attack, but now it has several versions, several names. Russian sources call it several attempts to break out of the encirclement. Ukrainian sources cite several attempts to encircle Russian units. But in general, there were attempts, but according to the information we received from the North Group of troops, these attacks were small, consisting of 10 to 15 people, and after all the attacks were repulsed, the overall intensity decreased to a minimum level. That is, if we compare the offensive attempts in the area of the aggregate plant and in the area of the same Gluboko. Then 2 waves of 30-90 people were used in Gluboko, up to 90 people. Then there are several waves of 10-15 people, and mainly by units of the 71st Jager Brigade. There is information that, in general, as a unit of the 71st Brigade, they are still in the citadel in an encircled state. But on the other hand, footage of the use of, let's say, Gbu-39 missiles by the armed forces of Ukraine against units of Russian troops in the area of the Volchansky Lyceum is being published. With this kind of weapons, they are trying to clear, perhaps, a bridgehead with the armed forces of Ukraine, in order to possibly unblock or possibly break through further either to the east, or to the west, or to the south. In turn, Russian units publish footage of full control over the terrain, drones. Strikes are being carried out on the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine along Grain Street, along Zareknaya Street. That is, along the main supply routes. Then we are moving with you towards East Volchansk. As you can see, we have updated the map here, and we have painted this territory yellow. This is the territory in the area of the settlement of Tikaya. Today, we received the first geolocation, confirming the control of the Ukrainian units over the village. In these frames, we can watch with you the arrival of 2 FABs on the territory of the village itself. Let me remind you that it is here that the armed forces of Ukraine are trying to concentrate more or less forces, at least some armored forces, with the help of which it is planned to attack the eastern outskirts of Volchansk, in order to unblock the main supply routes that can go through eastern Volchansk, then to Tikho, and then possibly to Zibno. Individual cartographers have already begun to paint. In general, the area is located in the eastern Pacific. That is, now, if you remember, at the very, let's say, denouement, the very development of the offensive, when reports on further advances were still received daily. Separately, cartographers painted over the maps up to the Barrel, up to the Krachny and Volokin. The entire territory is under the control of Russian units. However, today, when we see that the front as a whole has acquired a static character, pro-Russian cartographers are mostly starting to paint the map backwards. Today, let's say, quiet has already been painted. Separately, cartographers have already begun to paint the village of Zybina back in yellow. In general, I think that most likely it is. Russian units hardly stretched the front line, but in fact, based on all this, it is very important to understand the status of this forest right now. It is quite extensive, resembles perhaps some kind of maple leaf, or some kind of tree leaf. And the future capabilities of both the Ukrainian and Russian sides depend on who controls this big forest as a whole. Perhaps in the near future, it is for this forest that the main fighting will unfold. Since, in general, it is not possible to unblock the eastern Volchansky PC. It is possible that the fighting will shift even further to the northeast, namely in the area of this forest, between Marino and the Volchansky farms themselves. Then we are moving with you in the Nakopinsky direction, firm where very interesting information also comes. Russian units continue to make fire damage to positions in the forest located west of Kislovka-Kotlyrovka, west of Ivanovka. west of Stepovaya Novoselovka. The strike is carried out by drones, fabs fly into the Pevedrons. But in general, there is preparation before further offensive. Of course, a natural question arises, and when will this offensive be, and what forces, what means does the Russian army, the Ukrainian army, and so on and so forth have at their disposal? What chances does the Russian side have here to overcome the defense in the USU, and the Ukrainian side to hold out? And today, Ukrainian pro-Ukrainian sources and deep state cartographers have updated and published very interesting information about what is happening here and what further Russian plans are. And according to their words, according to the information we receive from all Ukrainian sources, the offensive is already ready and is about to begin. According to DIP, according to the Ukrainian resource, the armed forces of the Russian Federation have concentrated an army of 10,000 people in the area of the settlements of Svatov, Regorodok, Kalimachika. Of course, this army is not enough to take Kharkov straight, but it is quite possible to reach the same fragment, to reach Dobrovoy. 10,000 people, 450 soy pieces of equipment, including 200 artillery pieces. The main forces are concentrated precisely in the area, once again Svatov, near Mychika, the district town. That is, Novaya Igorovka. In other words, let's circle it on the map. This is approximately where this grouping is concentrated. And according to Ukrainian sources, this grouping is handing over this grouping to move along the line of the district town, Kopenka, and then Borovaya, in order to reach the Oskol River, the Oskol Reservoir, and, most importantly, the Gorokhovatskaya Dam in the Gorokhovatsky Bridge. And this operation, Ukrainian sources report, absolutely copies and duplicates the operation that was carried out at the beginning of a special military operation. It was the same route that the Russian units moved along last time. And of course, there is a conversation about how to prevent a breakthrough, and so on and so forth. And according to Ukrainian sources, the forces of the 20th Army, the Russian 20th Army and 3, are concentrated in this direction. And 144th Division, the 3rd 144th Division, which are represented by 236th Artillery Brigade, 11 regiments, 2 motorized, 2 tank, and 2 artillery. In other words, there is quite a serious grouping here. And today, literally, let's say even in confirmation of this news, Russian sources are already reporting that in the area of, let's say, the Borovoi-Gorokhovatsky Bridge occurred. The bridge was destroyed 2 hours ago. The news was published somewhere at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that is, around 12 o'clock in the afternoon, Iskander struck this bridge. And this crossing was completely destroyed. That is, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the day after tomorrow, Russian units will launch a large-scale offensive along this line. Since there is time, there is an opportunity to move, while the dams and supplies in the Borovaya area are completely disrupted. If we talk about Ukrainian sources, then they were transferred here from fresh ones. At least this information can be found in open sources of the units of the 3rd Azov Brigade, the 67th. That is, mainly those from the outside. On the Russian side, it is customary to call neo-Nazi brigades. That is, those who, let's say, are responsible for this direction. Once again, the 67th and 3rd Azov Brigades, which in the Russian Federation, among other things, is recognized as terrorist. In other words, these units, according to the available information in the public domain, will resist the offensive Russian army. Tank Brigade, Tank Army, 20th Army, Tank Division. Well, we will observe to what extent this information is true, or another media attack with the aim of generally defocusing attention. Then we are moving with you to the area of Razdalovka, where the assault actions of the settlement itself continue for many days. The armed forces of Ukraine are trying to rotate, evacuate, bring the bull, but the positions of the Russian army are already so close that it has become almost impossible to do this. In the footage, we see either the evacuation or the delivery of the bull, and the drones strike this car, this transport. The vehicle was destroyed. A little further north in the area of the farm is a similar story. Ukrainian units are either being evacuated, or simply being stored, or doing something else, and Russian drones are working on them. That is, in general, the days are numbered for Razdulovka. But for some time the armed forces of Ukraine are still planning to resist in this direction. Next, we are moving with you to the watch direction. The most important news comes from the area of the village of Kalinovka. To be more precise, Ukrainian units have published footage of drone strikes on the positions of the Russian army. In the area of northern Dachas, here in the area north of Lesovaya, but south of the farms. In other words, these shots confirm that over the past week, Russian units have managed to establish full control over Tli Street. And, in fact, reach the outskirts of the last stronghold, the last, say, another fortress, another citadel. This time on a smaller scale, but the citadels located in the North Kalinovka, which in fact the case opens up a further road for Russian units to Grigorovka from the south. Then we are moving with you to the Kleshaev direction, from where interesting information comes. As you can see, we have updated the map a little. Let me remind you that according to the latest configuration of the map, the forest located west of Kleshevka of this 225 was under the control of Russian units. However, just this week, pro-Ukrainian sources, pro-Ukrainian cartographers updated the maps, indicating that in general, the whole of Kleshevka is already in the gray zone. That is, it happened on the 15th of June, and the height of 225 is under the full control of the APU. However, we did not follow the data, let's say, to an interesting, product on the map. We left everything as it is, including the height of 225, under the control of the Russian army. But in general, this information was very interesting. And at the same time with this, somewhere around this time period, on June 9th, information was received that the Ukrainians had organized a counterattack in the area of the 227th height, and during the counterstrikes, it was possible to regain control of individual positions. However, again, it was more for information than for map adjustments. And today there were shots confirming that yes, indeed, the height of the south on the western outskirts of 227 height, under the control of the AFU units. In these frames, we can observe with you an attempt by Russian units to attack the positions of the 22nd Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And Russian troops were advancing with the use of a Mangel tank, or a turtle tank, which was stopped as a result of drone strikes. Then this tank was captured and taken to the rear of the Ukrainian army. And this event took place exactly at this point, which confirms that indeed the height of 227 is under the full control of the Division of Ukraine. That is, the card was rolled back a little bit. Then we are moving with you to the Avdiivka direction, where Russian units continue their assault operations. The pro-Ukrainian cartographers of Deep State assure that during the offensive measures, the Russian units managed to completely clean up and gain a foothold in the forest belt located south of the main stronghold between Kalinov and Arkhangelsk itself, that is. A small advance like this is here, but in general without any geolocation or confirmation. Of the interesting things, it is worth paying attention to the adjustment, also according to the pro-Ukrainian DIP, to the state that the Russian units finally, almost completely knocked out the APU from the areas of the stronghold. The company's stronghold located north of Sokol. That is, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, he has moved to this support, or is in a state of transition under the control of the Russian army. And they draw a large enough zone precisely because the Viso retreated. However, there was no geolocation. Practically the whole day nothing was received. Just before the very beginning of the shooting of this video, the first shots were received, published in the 47th, in my opinion, by the AFU brigade or by some kind. No, it's someone else. And footage has been published from the 110th Mechanized Work in Beer by drones on assault detachments of Russian units that are advancing along this stronghold. These frames, this video were geolocated. One in this area from the point, the second at this point. Based on these shots, we updated the map and painted over additional territory under the control of Russian units. There is an extremely high probability, approximately equal to 100%, that over the next night, the Russian army will finally clean up this Rotnik and will finally take the village of Sokol in a pincer. As for Sokol, here most cartographers continue to keep the settlement under the control of the Russian army, either most of it or part of it, until the intersection of Sokol Street and the road leading further north in the Yevgenyevka area. However, we rewound the map, let's say, and colored it into a gray zone after all. Let me remind you that most cartographers updated the map and established control by Russian units of this area. Based on this video, when there was a counter-fight between a Russian car and an American Bradley. And during this battle, and most cartographers painted the terrain illumination in red, or any other color that is responsible for the control of the Russian army. And after that, this happened, by the way, in the area, in my opinion, on the 8th or some June, to be more precise. That is, on the 7th of June, these shots were published. And after these 7th numbers, we did not receive a single geolocation. Let's increase the number of updates from the 8th of June. As you can see, there is not a single geolocation confirming. Even let's start from the 9th. Since the 9th of June, there has not been a single geolocation confirming the presence of Russian units here. But since the 9th of June, a large number of shots of artillery strikes and destroyed equipment of the armed forces of Ukraine have been published. Bradley was also destroyed, but mostly you see on, let's say, on the western part of this cloud. That is, it is possible that there is still an opportunity in the central part of the Russian army, some kind of strip, or some buildings here, some there. The possibility of trees is in the gray zone, and counterfights are underway. It's hard to say, but today, let's say, there were shots of artillery strikes, and strikes, in my opinion, by the sun. Yes, with the sun or multiple launch rocket systems right on the easternmost outskirts, which we painted yesterday as a territory under the control of Russian units. That is, there are two options. Either the video may be old before the most basic assault actions, or if the video is fresh, then perhaps the Russian army was forced to roll back to the east, northeast, where the main forces are concentrated. You see, there is a large amount of geolocation on the part of the armed forces of Ukraine. Drone strikes mainly by the 47th 110th Brigade on the Russian army stormtroopers, who are trying to storm this company stronghold. In other words, very brutal, very fierce fighting is being conducted here. While the situation is tense and difficult, but based on the progress that we see with you almost every day, we see that slowly but surely the whole situation is developing in favor of the Russian army. Then we are moving with you to the area of Novoselovka first. There is a separate geolocation, separate frames. Russian units control all logistics in the USU between Novoselovka the first, Amansky, all those small villages. The second line of defense, and maybe the third line of defense. And again, the next shots that were published over the past day, as the APU managed to establish another pontoon crossing along the beam. What is this beam called? Along the Charles Reservoir, along the Volcha River. And this reservoir was destroyed with the use of 2 blows of Krasnopol. In other words, it is, of course, a small river, but for technology, perhaps for Western, it is an insurmountable barrier. In general, the assaults are also continuing, equipment is being destroyed, delivery vehicles are being destroyed. Here, the APU is actually suffering heavy losses. To be more precise, let's say the 47th Brigade, which is the 25th, 47th. Which is responsible for defense in its bulk, is suffering losses. Here, during the battles for Avdiivka in January, February, and March, a large amount of Western equipment was concentrated, which, as we have repeatedly discussed, as a whole, fell into some kind of trap. Now it is not possible to escape from the direction, since all crossings, all bridges, are under fire control. The only thing that happens is that losses among equipment are brought to court every day, while Russian assault units are squeezing the trap. In order to reach the Charles Reservoir and these water barriers, the Volcha River, and so on and so forth. Pro-Ukrainian cartographers also confirm the advance of Russian units from the south, that is, along the line Umanskaya-Novoselovka the first. There is also a loop, and the whole bridgehead is shrinking, and in the near future, we should expect fighting in the locality itself. Extremely interesting information comes from the area of Yasnobrodovka. Here we see there are 2 zones. Let me remind you that this gray zone, or rather unconfirmed control, was mapped a long time ago, a few days ago. According to most pro-Ukrainian neutral cartographers, yes, the territory was taken under control. The output is obtained in the country. In my opinion, it is called Donetsk or like the mines. Well, somehow such an interesting name for this country village. They came out here as well. And now we see with you a big focus of various geolocations in the area of Yasna Brodovka. In these frames, we can observe with you the work of the multiple launch rocket system on possible retreating or moving units in the USU, right on the line of contact, very close to the advanced Russian positions. Powerful strikes, possibly losses. And in general, if we increase the number of updates from the 1st of June, then we remember that here in general, due to the fact that there is a very narrow bridgehead, very little space, then Russian units literally from the first days, from the first numbers, the beginning of the battles for the direction. Since the 12th of June, control has been established on almost all supply routes. The only little one is small. Not even supplies, but little or no paths for evacuation to Jesus have been preserved along the Bad River. That is, here is a bad river, a bad river. Here there is still an opportunity, having pressed as close as possible to the reservoir, let's say to retreat, or move, or just do something, and at the same time somehow have some kind of connection with the mainland. But it won't last long either. Footage has already been published from the Russian Sparta detachment strikes at Ukrainian units that are trying to move right along this river. And it's already unsafe, it's already under fire control, and it's already associated with high losses. And the most important shots were also published today. This is an attempt to storm, perhaps not the first building in the area of Yasna Brodovka itself. In the footage we see with you, published by Ukrainian sources, a Russian Beha with a landing party on board, under the attack of a Ukrainian drone. And Beha reaches the point of, let's say, disembarkation. This is a small building, perhaps some kind of cottage, some kind of tourist building would have been in the past. We see with you the landing dismounts and begins to take up positions in the building itself. This video confirms full control over this area, and based on this, we have updated the map, painting over this support, or a couple of forest belts under the control of Russian units. In other words, if we summarize everything, then in general, the history on the Brodovka has already ended. There are shots here of a retreat in Nabudovka to the area of the mainland. There are shots of the storming of Ya from Nabudovka. In other words, if we summarize all this, then of course I personally come to the conclusion that this artillery pocket is already completely under the control of the Russian army. There are no more positions here, perhaps some remaining rearguards who are still trying to move away and not get surrounded, but will either try to cross the water barriers in some other way. But again, I repeat, if we summarize everything, draw some small conclusions, then most likely this whole territory is either already empty, in the sense of without soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine, or already under the control of Russian units, or is about to come under the control of the Russian army. After that, a small pause is possible, since it is unlikely that Russian stormtroopers, Russian units will try to cross this isthmus, due to the further location of a large company strongpoint in the area of Karlovka, which will be extremely difficult to overcome in such a narrow space. For sure it will be closed, let's say, preserved, detachments will be put up, and further attempts will be made to attack both Karlovka, so it may be Boring, or Mezovaya. Then we are moving with you to the south. Small adjustments on Georgievka, Russian units, continuing assault actions on Maximilievka. But so far, all the assaults are limited exclusively to posts on social networks. There is a small adjustment on the map according to, let's say, reliable cartographers south of Georgievka. In other words, several strongholds just south of the farms came under control, but nothing more serious. According to Paraskovevka, according to Ugledar, information is received from this direction that some Ukrainian units have lost their positions again, while they did not warn about the loss of adjacent positions, in order to preserve the reputation or some other purpose. And this situation was taken advantage of by Russian units, and during, let's say, an unexpected assault, some units of the AFU in the direction, most likely from the 72nd Brigade, were surrounded. Most likely we are talking about this career. That is, somewhere here there is some kind of mess, and not just a mess, but with a large number, or well, as a relatively large number of surrounded Ukrainian soldiers trapped in the cauldron. But so far this information has not been confirmed. Everything is exclusively against the background of messages, but mostly from Ukrainian sources. There is no news on the harvest. Russian units continue to sweep the central part. Let me remind you that according to the latest footage, a separate mechanized group broke through closer to the northern part, and now, perhaps, consolidation will come there. And they have gained a foothold. And now the Russian gunners are leveling the positions between the advanced, let's say, paratroopers, and those who are moving towards them. And the Ukrainian basements in the harvest are being leveled in order to further advance. Sweep and advance as much as possible to the northern part of the settlement. There is no news on the work direction. The only thing worth paying attention to is that just before the start of the video, Ukrainians published footage of the use of a bomb. An air bomb by JDAM-NR. Here on these frames, Ukrainians report that a certain command center was struck in Vasilevka. Although, perhaps, even based on the graphics, this is some kind of maybe even a deep fake. Something has been created with the participation of a neural network. But in general, the personnel are very important because more and more often the armed forces of Ukraine use aviation. Aviation bombs are still present, let's say, the complete superiority of Russian aviation, and the nomenclature of bombs used by the Russian side. But more and more often we get footage and how the APU is being used, including the J-ladies using the same guided bombs there.